Welcome back to The Legal Take, where we break down the law behind today's biggest headlines, with clarity, context, and real-world insight. I'm Andrea Holzer. Today's story is a dramatic and controversial moment at the intersection of federal law enforcement, civil rights, use of force standards, and federal-state tensions. On January 7, 2026, an ICE agent shot and killed Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old Minneapolis woman, during a large immigration enforcement operation. The incident was captured on video, widely shared online, and has triggered protests, political backlash, legal disputes, and competing narratives about what actually happened. In this episode, we'll explain what we know about the shooting itself so far, the legal frameworks governing federal use of force, why Minnesota and federal officials are now at odds, what prosecutors can and can't do legally, and the broader implications for law enforcement and civil liberties. Let's begin with the facts on the ground. On January 7th, 2026, in a residential neighborhood in South Minneapolis near Portland Avenue, federal immigration agents were conducting an enforcement operation as part of Operation Metro Surge, a large DHS-led effort involving thousands of immigration officials in Minnesota. Operation Metro Surge was launched in early December 2025 and has involved a major scale-up of immigration enforcement, with DHS employing thousands of immigration agents to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area amid heightened public attention and protest activity. On that date, Renee Good, a 37-year-old American citizen, was fatally shot by United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent Jonathan Ross in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Good was in her car, stopped sideways in the street blocking traffic, when Ross drove around her vehicle and returned on foot. Other agents approached, and one ordered her to get out of her car while reaching through her open window. Ross moved to the front left of her vehicle as Good briefly reversed, then began driving into the direction of traffic while turning away from Ross. While remaining upright, Ross fired 3 shots, killing her. 1 through the windshield, then 2 through the open driver's side window from the side of her vehicle as it passed him. Ross reportedly drove away from the scene that day, but reports are still conflicting as to whether Good struck Ross with her car. But there has been consistent reporting that Ross was treated at the hospital later that day for internal bleeding. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara described the vehicle as sideways in the roadway when officers arrived, while federal and local leaders offered differing accounts of exactly how the confrontation unfolded. The victim was a wife and mother who lived just blocks away from where she was shot. Almost immediately, the shooting became a flashpoint in political and legal debate. Federal officials, including the Department of Homeland Security and the White House, pushed back against calls for a broad civil rights investigation, with senior Justice Department leadership stating there was no basis for a criminal civil rights inquiry into the ICE agent's actions, suggesting he acted in self-defense. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche publicly defended that position and emphasized that the agent's actions were being reviewed internally, but would not be subject to a formal DOJ civil rights investigation at this time. At the same time, state officials, including Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis leaders, expressed deep concern about federal control of the investigation and pushed back against federal narratives that characterized the shooting as justified or uncontroversial. There's also brisk political dispute over federal presence in Minnesota, with Minnesota's Attorney General filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration, seeking to end the surge of ICE and DHS agents, alleging constitutional overreach and violation of civil liberties. One of the most controversial aspects of this case isn't just what happened on the street, it's what hasn't happened since. As of now, the federal government has made clear it does not intend to bring criminal charges against the ICE agent involved. Senior officials within the Department of Justice have publicly stated that they see no basis for a federal civil rights prosecution, framing the shooting as a use of force decision made in the line of duty. That decision ultimately traces back to leadership at the top of the federal government. Under the Trump administration, the Justice Department has taken a notably narrower view of when federal officers should face criminal scrutiny, particularly in cases involving immigration enforcement. DOJ leadership has emphasized deference to officer judgment and internal review processes, rather than outside criminal investigations. Legally, this matters because federal prosecutors are the only ones who can bring federal criminal charges against a federal agent for actions taken in the scope of their duties. If DOJ declines to act, there is no alternative federal path forward. That doesn't mean the shooting was lawful. It means prosecutors believe they cannot meet the very high burden required to prove a criminal civil rights violation beyond a reasonable doubt. And that burden is extremely high. To secure a conviction, prosecutors would have to prove the agent willfully violated the victim's constitutional rights. Not that he made a bad judgment call, not that the shooting was unnecessary, but that he knowingly and intentionally used unlawful force. Historically, DOJ brings these cases rarely, even when the public reaction is intense. So why is the DOJ standard so high? This is where many people feel frustrated, because the legal standard for criminal accountability doesn't always align with public expectations of justice. Criminal civil rights cases against law enforcement require proof of intent, not just harm. The government must show the officer knew the force was unlawful at the moment it was used. In situations involving fast-moving encounters, alleged threats, and disputed video evidence, prosecutors often conclude that they cannot prove intent, even if the outcome was tragic. That's why DOJ's refusal to charge does not mean the shooting was justified. It means the legal threshold for criminal prosecution likely could not be met under existing law. One of the major legal issues in this case is who gets to investigate and how. Initially, Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension was supposed to work alongside the FBI to review the shooting and evidence. But federal prosecutors later reversed course, removing state investigators from the case and asserting that the FBI, not Minnesota authorities, would lead the investigation. The BCA publicly stated it would no longer have access to scene evidence, interviews, or materials needed for independent investigation under Minnesota law, prompting criticism from state leaders who say this undermines transparency and trust. This raises questions about federal supremacy, state investigative authority, and whether a state can legally pursue charges against a federal agent when the evidence is controlled at the federal level. Legal experts note that federal officers enjoy certain immunities, and federal jurisdiction often preempts state prosecution. But that doesn't mean state or local prosecutors have no legal avenue. It just complicates the process. To understand the legal stakes, we need to unpack the standards governing use of force by law enforcement. Under federal law, an officer, whether local or federal, may use deadly force only when they reasonably believe they or others are in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. The government's position is that the agent fired because he believed Good's vehicle posed a threat. The footage is debated and eyewitness accounts vary. Critics, including civil rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, argue that multiple videos showing the encounter contradict claims that Good weaponized her vehicle against officers, and suggest the use of force may have been excessive. This tension between a federal officer's right to self-defense and the need to protect civilian life is at the heart of many controversial use of force cases nationwide. The shooting has sparked widespread protests in Minneapolis and beyond. Activists and community organizers have decried the killing, pointing out perceived patterns of aggressive federal enforcement and racial bias. Public demonstrations have extended outside Minnesota, with rallies and solidarity events in several states, from urban centers to small towns, under slogans criticizing ICE practices and demanding accountability. The shooting has also become a political lightning rod, with state and local officials accusing federal leadership of using immigration enforcement as a political spectacle. While opponents argue supporters of the administration dismiss legitimate safety concerns. Worth noting is the fact that criminal charges are not the only form of accountability. The family of the women killed may still pursue civil lawsuits, and this is where the legal landscape shifts. Civil cases don't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, plaintiffs must show, by a preponderance of the evidence, that the agent's actions were unreasonable or unconstitutional. That opens the door to several potential claims. First, the family could bring a constitutional civil rights lawsuit under federal law, alleging excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Second, they may pursue wrongful death claims, depending on jurisdictional hurdles and whether sovereign immunity applies. But here's the key complication: qualified immunity. Federal officers are often shielded from civil liability unless plaintiffs can show that the officer violated a clearly established constitutional right. Meaning, prior court decisions must have made it obvious that the conduct was unlawful. This doctrine has become one of the biggest barriers to civil accountability of law enforcement nationwide. Even if a court finds the shooting deeply troubling, the case could still be dismissed if judges conclude the law wasn't clearly established in that precise factual scenario. Another question viewers often ask is whether the federal government itself can be sued. In limited circumstances, yes, but those cases are difficult. Claims against federal agencies typically fall under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which allows lawsuits against the government for certain wrongful acts by federal employees. However, claims involving law enforcement and discretionary decision-making are often excluded, and constitutional claims generally cannot be brought directly against the federal government. In other words, even civil litigation faces steep legal barriers, not because the harm isn't real, but because the law strongly protects federal officers and agencies. So, can Minnesota prosecute a federal agent? The short answer, it's legally complicated. As we discussed previously, federal officers conducting lawful duties typically have federal immunity protections, and states often lack jurisdiction to bring criminal charges for actions taken in the scope of federal employment, especially when evidence and investigation are controlled by the federal government. However, state prosecutors have signaled they will pursue every legal avenue, even as federal authorities restrict evidence access. Official statements from Hennepin County and the Minnesota Attorney General's office emphasize they are evaluating legal options, including how to force access to critical evidence. This part of the story is ongoing, and it could set important precedent for state oversight into federal enforcement actions. Taken together, this case highlights a growing accountability gap. When the federal government declines to prosecute, states are blocked from acting. Civil lawsuits face immunity defenses, and families and communities are often left without a clear path to justice. That gap fuels public outrage, not just over this incident, but over the system itself. And unless Congress and the courts change the legal standards governing federal law enforcement accountability, similar cases are likely to end the same way. No criminal charges, prolonged civil litigation, and unresolved questions about responsibility. The fatal ICE shooting in Minneapolis raises complex questions about use of force, federal-state relations, prosecutorial authority, and public trust in law enforcement. What we do know is that the legal system is still working through these issues, and that the facts on the ground remain contested. Bodies of law, from federal supremacy doctrines to constitutional protections, will shape how this story unfolds in the days and months to come. This isn't just a story about one shooting in Minnesota. It's about who gets investigated, who gets charged, and who ultimately decides when force crosses the legal line. If you found today's breakdown helpful, subscribe and hit the bell for deeper legal context on the stories shaping our world. I'm Andrea Holzer, and this has been The Legal Take. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and stay legally minded.